oversight and confidence in government, and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Right here. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2013, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Minority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, ending domestic violence is not a quixotic quest. It is a noble calling, and this is why we have filed HRES 392, a resolution supporting the goals and ideals of October as National Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and expressing the sense of the House of Representatives that Congress should continue to raise awareness of domestic violence and its devastating effects on individuals, families, and communities, and support programs designed to end domestic violence in the United States. Mr. Speaker, I'm honored to tell you that we will have a number of speakers, and at this time, I'm going to yield to the Congresswoman from the 4th District of Maryland. She serves on Science and Technology, Transportation and Infrastructure. She co-chairs the Women's Caucus, and she is the chair of the Democratic Women's Working Group. She also co-founded the National Network to End Domestic Violence in 1994. She was its executive director. I'm proud to ask my colleague, the Honorable Donna Edwards, to consume as much time as she may.
I thank the gentleman, and I thank you very much, and I know that you join with your colleague, Mr. Poe of Texas, in hosting this hour so that we can have an opportunity to remember why it is that we identify and commemorate Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and to make a commitment from this day forward in this coming year to the next time we have this observance to do what we can to end domestic violence. And I think, after all, that is the goal. I can't remember, Mr. Green, when I first became interested in domestic violence and even aware of domestic violence, but I look back to the times when I was growing up. I grew up in a military family, and we lived in very close quarters, and our neighbors, we shared a wall in that military family housing. And in our neighbor's house, there was clearly something going on. My sister and I shared a bedroom, and we could hear what was going on, and it was violent. It was clearly violent. I don't know that I understood that at the time, Mr. Speaker, but I have come to understand it as an adult, and it frames my commitment, lifelong commitment, to ending domestic violence. I remember at that time the military police being called, and they would come and they would drive the gentleman around the block, and then he would be delivered right back home. And then a few nights later, the exact same thing would happen again. I remember my sister and I seeing the woman who lived next door, and we were friends with their children. And I remember seeing her, and I was always intrigued by her dark glasses and her great makeup and the scarves that she wore around her neck. It wasn't until later that I understood that she was covering her black eye, she was covering the bruises on her neck, that she was covering the bruises on her face from having been a victim of domestic violence. It was many, many years, in fact, as an adult, where I came to really process and understand what was going on. I think because domestic violence affects so many around the country, that and particularly and most particularly affects women, that there's almost a chance that in any given family or at a family reunion or family gathering, you will find someone, if you probe just enough, you will find someone who has experienced domestic violence. Very sadly, you will also find many young children who've witnessed domestic violence. And I think that we have only to look at the children who are growing up in homes where mostly their mothers are being abused. And then we wonder why it is that when we look at the population of young people who are incarcerated, and when you ask them one by one, and I've done this, I've visited incarcerated youth, and almost to a one, they will tell you that either they have been the victims of violence or they grew up in a violent home. I think, Mr. Speaker, it must resonate with us that we have to ask ourselves why it is that we continue to have violence and what it is that we can do to get to the root cause of that violence. And so, in addition, during Domestic Violence Awareness Month, to identifying the fact that we lose about $8 billion a year in productivity that's lost because of domestic violence, lost time off of work, medical expenses, and the rest. We know that it's a social ill that's very pervasive. We also know that there are other kinds of crimes that are associated with domestic violence. Stalking is one of those, sexual assault within a relationship. Mr. Speaker, we also are aware that our young women ages 16 to 24 are more likely than not to experience some form of violence in those relationships. And so while earlier this year, and it took us some time to get there, Mr. Speaker, we did finally reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act. The Violence Against Women Act, which was first authorized in 1994, I was a part of that, helped to lead that effort on the outside while our leaders in Congress were leading on the inside. Leaders like our now Vice President Joe Biden, who was in the Senate and who took this bull by the horns and led us to the passage of the first Violence Against Women Act that was signed into law by President Clinton. And it was the first time ever that the federal government came forward and said we have a real commitment to ending domestic violence by providing resources for shelters and services, training law enforcement, making sure that our judges were equipped to handle these cases in court, providing advocacy services for those who are experiencing violence and going through the system. And over each successive couple of years, we've reauthorized the Violence Against Women Act. We did that just recently. And as I said, in these tough economic times, it's been very difficult. All of a sudden, domestic violence became partisan and political. But I'm glad to say, Mr. Speaker, that we did finally reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act again. We are providing those resources to those who experience violence. But it should also come as no surprise that as we engage in the fiscal debates that we have here in the Congress, that because of sequester and shutting down the government even, that many of those shelters and services and programs are in fact experiencing a really difficult time at the same time that they're experiencing more demand. And so I don't say that, Mr. Speaker, to call out one side or the other, but I am glad we're back at a point where in this Domestic Violence Awareness Month we take the politics out of domestic violence and we say to women, whether you're Republicans or Democrats or independents or you don't think about politics at all, that we care about ending domestic violence. We care about the fact, Mr. Speaker, that more women are placed in a much more dangerous circumstance when there is a weapon in the home and that weapon is used to either kill or harm or threaten the lives of those who are in the home. That's something that we can do something about. And Mr. Speaker, let me just say this. This last year we lost a really powerful advocate for those who experience domestic violence. When Senator Frank Lautenberg died earlier this year from New Jersey, we remembered him in a lot of ways as a leader, Mr. Speaker, but on this Domestic Violence Awareness Month, I would like the nation to remember Senator Lautenberg because he was the one who spearheaded the domestic violence firearm prevention that said that if you are committing domestic violence and you have a domestic violence offense, that you cannot purchase or possess a weapon. It recognized, the federal government and the Congress recognized the importance of removing a weapon from a home where there's domestic violence, and Senator Lautenberg was the champion. And so Mr. Speaker, I would like to close. I know that we have other speakers, and just to say that this member of Congress, and I know that our colleagues here today remain committed to ending domestic violence, to making sure that women can achieve their fullest potential by living in a home that's free of violence. And that, in fact, as we look around the world, whether it is in Afghanistan or Iraq, or it's in South or Central America, or in Africa, in many nations, women experience violence in relationships in their home. But, Mr. Speaker, if we can just end that violence in the home, then we would do a lot to make certain that children are growing up healthy and able to have healthy relationships, and that women are able to achieve their fullest potential. And so I join you today in calling attention to Domestic Violence Awareness Month, into redoubling our commitment to end domestic violence. And a special thank you and salute to an organization that I started now, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, the National Network to End Domestic Violence, and all of the network of advocates around the country who are committed to the same things that we are. And if only we can provide the resources that they need to do their work, I'm convinced that we can end this scourge. And with that, I yield.
And I thank you very much for your testimony. Actually, it's something that I believe will benefit a good many persons who are viewing this today. I would like to share just a few stories, if I may. Mr. Speaker, I practiced law in Houston, Texas, and my practice was one that involved a good deal of civil work. And in the early 70s, I can recall females coming to my office to receive assistance from a lawyer to file charges based upon abuse that had been imposed upon them. And in some of the cases, the damage done to the person was physical, immediately seen. But as you talked to the person, you could see that this person had been suffering for years. Literally years of suffering would emerge from this person in a 30-minute, 1 hour, hour and a half visit. And they would plead with me, please help me get the charges filed. The plea was there because at that time it was considered a family issue. And when women would go in to file charges, the police would say, well, we'll look at it, we'll see if we can get somebody out there. But they didn't always respond to the need that was evident. The need was evident because of what the eye could see. And many of the ladies that would come into my office, the women that would come in, would bring a minister or some other person to corroborate the story. There was this belief that your physical appearance alone was not enough evidence to support the filing of charges. And unfortunately, society had so developed at that time that we would take this victim to intake, and we would help with the filing of the charges, and we'd help get charges filed. And the unfortunate circumstance was that the culture at that time was such that other family members would visit with the victim and encourage the victim to drop the charges. Family members seeing and knowing about the abuse not only on this occasion for which charges were being filed, but also the abuse that had occurred through the years. And family members would quite often prevail. And as a result, charges would sometimes be dropped. And I regret that we went through this time in our history where women were not treated with the dignity and respect that they should be accorded. A lot of that has gone away, and I'll say more about a lot of this in just a moment. But there are still enough of it for us to band together and for us to answer the clarion call for help that these women present to us on a daily basis. I'm honored to tell you that we have with us now another member of Congress from the 40th District of California. She serves on the Appropriations Committee, and I'm honored to ask that she consume as much time as she may, the Honorable Lucille Roybal Allard.
Unanimous consent to address the House for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, let me begin by commending Congressman Green for his leadership in helping to highlight the tragedy of domestic violence in our country and for arranging today's special order. While it is true that we have made some progress toward addressing violence against women, the fact remains that nearly 1/3 of women in the United States still report being physically or sexually abused by a partner in their lifetime. Domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking lead to severe social, health, and economic consequences for women and our communities, with the estimated cost of violence exceeding $70 billion each year. Our nation's economic crisis has hammered home the sad truth that financial concerns often keep victims in abusive relationships. Studies indicate that economic independence is a key predictor of whether a victim will be able to break the cycle of violence and leave her abuser. Far too often, it is difficult for victims to maintain employment in the aftermath of domestic violence, especially if they require time off for medical appointments, court appearances, and for their own safety. As a result, women who experience domestic violence are more likely than other women to be unemployed, to suffer from health problems that impact employability and job performance, to report lower personal income, and to rely on welfare. These poor economic outcomes often perpetuate the abuse. For the last 16 years, I have introduced legislation that would help ensure victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking have the financial independence they need to break free from their abusers. The Security and Financial Empowerment Act, or SAFE Act, would allow survivors to take unpaid time off from work to make necessary court appearances, seek legal assistance, and get help with safety planning without the fear of losing their job. The SAFE Act would prohibit employers or insurance providers from basing hiring insurance coverage decisions on individuals' history of abuse and ensure eligibility for unemployment benefits should a survivor be forced to leave her job due to circumstances stemming from domestic violence. The SAFE Act empowers victims of domestic violence with greater employment protections and increased economic stability to break the all-too-common cycle of dependence and abuse. As Domestic Violence Awareness Month comes to an end, let us not forget the victims of domestic violence. I ask my colleagues to join me in ensuring financial freedom for those suffering from domestic abuse by co-sponsoring the SAFE Act. And I encourage my colleagues to support Congressman Green's H.Res. 392 to make sure that we continue to highlight this tragedy of domestic violence in our country so that one day there will be no domestic violence and that it will be unnecessary for us to be here in this halls of Congress talking about this tragedy. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank the lady for the work that she has done here in Congress over the years to eliminate domestic violence. This has been a bipartisan effort, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to tell you that S-47, the Violence Against Women Reauthorization, this bill passed the House of Representatives with bipartisan support. In the House, the vote was 286 to 138. It passed the Senate with bipartisan support. It was 78 to 22. The bill had this bipartisan support because it embraced not only women who are known to us as people from our communities, but also there are some communities that were embraced that have not been traditionally a part of the bill. It helped the women who are American Indians because at one time tribal courts could not take on persons who had sexually assaulted women because they were non-Indians. Well, the bill addressed this. It also addressed the LGBT community, which had not been included. It doesn't matter what your sexual preference is, domestic violence can be imposed upon you. And when you are hurt, you need help. This bill provided the help needed for women regardless of race, creed, color, origin, regardless of your sexual preference. You can get help pursuant to S-47, which received bipartisan support. I'm honored to tell you that annually, my friend from the state of Texas, the Honorable Ted Poe, works with me and I with him. We alternate on years of taking the lead on this issue. He has had a career that has paralleled mine. When he was a prosecutor, I was a defense attorney. He became a district court judge in Texas right around the time I became the judge of a justice court. Here in Congress, we have sought to work together on many bills and many pieces of legislation, but I'm proudest of what we do on domestic violence. Domestic Violence Awareness Month is one that he and I have collaborated to work together on to make sure that we get this issue exposed to the public so that we can continue the process of elimination. I'm proud to tell you that he represents the 2nd District of Texas, serves on Foreign Affairs, as well as the Judiciary Committee, and I'm proud to tell you that I consider him a friend, not in the sense that we politely say it here in Congress when we say my friend. I consider him a friend in the sense that he and I have developed a real kinship and relationship. Though we don't always agree, we always try to work together for the good of our state, city, and for the good of women who are being impacted by domestic violence. I would ask my friend, the Honorable Ted Poe, to consume as much time as he may.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I appreciate those comments. It is true, Congressman Green, you and I, our careers have mirrored. We spent time at the courthouse together, as you a defense lawyer, me as a prosecutor. We became judges at about the same time. We got elected to Congress the same time. We've known each other now almost 40 years. And I want to thank you for all that time that you have been in serving the community of Texas. And our districts match each other there in the Houston area. We share the same common boundary. I think it's appropriate that we're wearing purple ties today. If I remember correctly, if you take red and you take blue and you mix them together, you get purple. How appropriate, because this is a bipartisan endeavor that we are trying to show the horrors of domestic violence nationwide. It's not a Democrat issue, it's not a Republican issue, it's an American issue. I guess it's a purple issue, if we can use that phrase. As you have mentioned, spending time at the courthouse, I saw a lot of these type of cases. And we have come a long way. And yes, it is true. I remember the days when domestic violence, when some spouse would beat up another spouse, no matter how bad the injuries, unless it was death, many times the police would say, this is a family problem. It's not a criminal problem. It's not a public problem. It's a family problem. They got to deal with it. And because of that, many women primarily were rejected from prosecuting their spouse when they beat them up. And as you mentioned, Congressman Green, the days of a spouse filing charges and then pressured by sometimes the batterer or family members to drop the charges, then charges would be dropped. I found that frustrating as a prosecutor, and you found it frustrating when you're trying to help those women get those cases filed. We finally did something in Texas that made a whole lot of sense. We took the spouse, the victim, out of the prosecution process. So it was the state of Texas versus the guy, and spouse really had no control over prosecution, certainly couldn't drop the charges, took it off of her burden and made that those people who wanted the case to drop to deal with the state rather than deal with the victim. That was a good thing because then those people started getting prosecuted. My friend Jim Costa and I, Jim Costa, as you know, is a Democrat from California. He and I started the Victims' Rights Caucus when I came to Congress. It's a bipartisan caucus, purple caucus, of both sides that advocate on part of victims, about 85, 90 members. And one of the things that we're very concerned about, of course, is spouses that are victims of crime. And I say that because when somebody beats up someone in the family, it is not the fault of the victim. It's the fault of the person that does the assaulting. The victim is not to blame. And we have to get through our culture, and I think we're gradually doing that, to understand it's not the victim's fault. It's the person who commits the crime, commits the assault. Most influential person in my life was my grandmother. God bless her. She lived till 99 years of age. She told me a lot of things that was very wise. You'd be glad to know, Congressman Green, she was old-fashioned Texas yellow dog Democrat. Never forgave me for being a Republican. But anyway, we got past that. She said that you never hurt somebody you claim you love. That was a true statement when she told me. And it's still a true statement. You never hurt somebody you claim you love, especially in the family situation. And that is something that we need to live by and hold people accountable when they violate that important, really, rule of life. You mentioned the Violence Against Women's Act. Good piece of legislation. I supported that for the reasons you mentioned, but also it does something else. It helps the immigrant community. Too often we find in Houston, where we have a lot of immigrants from all over the world, that someone is in the United States, they are assaulted by someone else that's in the United States, both undocumented, and the batterer tells the victim that if you call the police, I'm going to send you back to where you came from. Now, he can't do that, but she thinks he can do that. And so she doesn't call the police. And this guy gets away with hurting her. And plus, she continues to be victimized. We changed that law because of VAWA. They can come forward, they can get a special visa, they can testify, this person can get prosecuted as he should. So it's a good piece of legislation, and we certainly need to be enforcing the rules under the VAWA law. People that I have come in contact with over the years have impacted me. And, of course, many of those have been victims of crime, many of those victims of domestic violence. One that I met after I came here to Congress was a wonderful lady that lives real close to us. She lives over in Maryland, Yvette Cade. She's made her story public, so I use her name. Yvette Cade was estranged from her husband. She was under a protective order. He was under a protective order. Leave her alone. She didn't have a lawyer. She didn't have someone like you, Mr. Green, representing her. She had to represent herself. When the protective order came to be renewed, she represented herself in the courtroom, and the judge denied the protective order. So it was withdrawn. Soon after the judge made that horrible decision, the estranged husband found her over at the video store where she worked, supporting herself. He walked in. He carried a jar of gasoline. He poured it over Yvette Cade, and he set her on fire. That wonderful, precious lady. And it's all on videotape from the store. I don't know how she did it, but she survived. A passerby saw what happened. He helped her. He put the fire out. She's had numerous surgeries, and she's alive, and today she advocates on behalf of victims who are abused in the family. And quite a remarkable person. But she's a victim of crime. And our culture needs to treat these people in a special way. whether it's to prosecute the criminal or to take care of them when their needs, their physical, mental needs, need to be met. And we're doing a better job of that. This month, we recognize those people, those wonderful people who have been abused. We still have the problem of convincing them that the crime is not their fault. They are embarrassed so often. As I told victims of crime as a prosecutor and even as a judge, you don't need to be embarrassed for what happened to you. The person who did it needs to be embarrassed. And it was part of our responsibility, I think, in the criminal justice system, make sure that happened. I won't go into all those types of cases that you are familiar with on those unique sentencing, Mr. Green, but we made sure that the criminal knew that he was to blame and the victim was not to blame for that conduct. Once, and after hearing 25,000 felony cases at the courthouse, and Congressman Green, I'm not going to relate all 25,000 of them, but I would like to mention another one. And when we think of domestic violence, we need to remember not only the spouse, but we need to think about the children that are involved too. Because many times, they are the victims of domestic violence. And there was a young girl who was a second grader. And she, like a lot of kids today, she rode the bus back and forth to school, to elementary school. I'll call her June. And when she, one afternoon, she's coming back home, she's riding the school bus home, she wouldn't get off the bus. She just sat there. And she was literally gripping that bar that's in front, or on the seat in front of you. Finally, the school bus driver came back and tried to talk to her and asked her, why won't you get off the bus? This is your home. This is where you live. And June replied, I don't want to get off because I'm only safe when I'm on the bus going to school, at school, and when I'm on the bus going home. But bad things happen when I get off the bus. Because, see, she went back into a situation where she was constantly battered by the live-in boyfriend, is what I'm going to call him. And because of the bus driver and doing what she did, called the police, an investigation took place. That person was prosecuted, but more importantly, June is safe and her mother is safe. We need to understand that victims of domestic violence live many times quiet lives of desperation and fear. And it's our responsibility as Congress to eliminate that the best we can, to provide services for victims, to let them understand the crime is not their fault, it's the fault of the perpetrator. And then on the other end, we need to make sure those perpetrators get justice that they deserve at the courthouse, and they're held accountable for those actions that they commit against someone in their family. Because, Mr. Speaker, Grandma was right. You'd never hurt somebody you claim you love. And I'll yield back to the gentleman from Texas. Thank you very much.
I thank my colleague very much, and I thank you for your many words expressing what you actually witnessed. Yours was a testimony, not just a recitation from something that was accorded you by some other person. You were there to see what happened, and you and I know that there is still great work to be done. In our state of Texas, in 2012, domestic violence caused 11,994 adults to need shelter, Mr. Speaker, caused 14,534 children to need shelter, Mr. Speaker, caused 36,831 adults to need non-residential services, counseling, legal assistance, caused 15,694 children to need non-residential services. And unfortunately, 26.2% of the adults were denied shelter because of a lack of space. So, Mr. Speaker, there is still great work to be done, and I'm honored to ask at this time another colleague to speak. However, would you kindly advise me as to the amount of time that we have left?
The gentleman has 25 minutes remaining.
Thank you. I ask so that members may be aware. We have a few members left to speak, and we want to make sure that every member has some time. At this time, Mr. Speaker, my very dear friend from the great state of California, the 13th Congressional District, who sits on appropriations and who has been a longtime champion of protecting women and protecting people. She is truly a champion for the least, the last, and the lost. I'm honored to ask the Honorable Barbara Lee to move to the podium and consume an appropriate amount of time. I might also add, Mr. Speaker, that she was the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, and I was proud to serve under her leadership.
Thank you very much. First, let me thank Congressman Al Green for that very humbling introduction, for your tremendous leadership, and for bringing us all together with, of course, Congressman Poe, for really pulling together this special order in recognition of October as Domestic Violence Awareness Month. It is so critical that we continue to raise the level of awareness in a bipartisan manner until we rid our country and the world of abuse and domestic violence. As someone who unfortunately understands domestic violence on a very personal level, a deeply personal level, I know how traumatic the experience is. And yes, I know what the support system and how important the support system is needed to emerge as a survivor. I also know that domestic violence is not only physical, but it's also emotional. It is brutal, it is dehumanizing to the battered and the batterer, and without strong and enforceable criminal laws and services, one's life can be shattered and destroyed. I know this from personal experience. Also, as a psychiatric social worker by profession, battered women's syndrome will totally destroy a woman's life if we don't address the counseling and mental health services that will really help women rid themselves of the syndrome which comes as a result of a lifetime of abuse. So as a member of the California legislature, I wrote, and I was very proud to write, the California's Violence Against Women's Act, and many, many domestic violence bills that were actually signed into law, Congressman Green, by a Republican governor, Governor Pete Wilson. And I continue to make this a priority in my congressional work. Now, in my district, there are several agencies, such as A Safe Place, which is a victim-centered agency. Agencies such as this, they do wonderful work for a minimum budget on issues and services and housing related to and for victims of abuse, and we need to enhance and raise the level of funding because they do wonderful work, as I said, with minimal resources. We know that staying in a shelter or working with an advocate significantly improves the victim's quality of life. It's my hope that we use Domestic Violence Awareness Month to recommit ourselves to fighting the scourge of domestic violence against men and women. We have made accomplishments over the decades on this issue, including the passage of the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act and the Violence Against Women Act, which we fought hard to get reauthorized earlier this year under the bold and tremendous leadership of Congresswoman Gwen Moore and Leader Nancy Pelosi. These pieces of legislation have led to an increase of nearly 51% already, 51% in domestic violence reporting by women and a 37% increase in reporting for men. This is truly a significant impact. Yet sadly, challenges remain. Around the world, nearly 1 in 3 women have been beaten, coerced into sex, or otherwise abused in her lifetime. Here in the United States, as many as 1 in 4 American women report being physically or sexually abused by a husband or a boyfriend at least once in their lives. In my home state of California, the statistics are even more staggering. According to the Women's Health Survey, approximately 40% of California women experience physical, intimate partner violence in their lifetimes. Of these women, 3 out of 4 of them had children under the age of 18 at home. Children who see or experience domestic violence have a much greater chance to either become victims or perpetrators as adults. They're also more likely to attempt suicide, abuse drugs and alcohol, run away from home, engage in teenage prostitution, and commit other crimes. Beyond the cost to children, Domestic violence affects the economy, with as many as half of domestic violence victims reporting the loss of a job due at least in part to domestic violence. In fact, domestic violence costs employers in the United States as much as $13 billion each year, costs our health care system upwards of $5.8 billion, including $4 billion in direct health care expenses. So when we talk about the state of employment and the cost of health care, especially for women, the economic impacts of domestic violence and what we must do to eradicate it must be part of that conversation. We must prioritize investments in programs that domestic violence survivors rely on when escaping their abusers, including domestic violence programs and other programs of the safety net. When we fail to make the proper investments, women bear the consequences. Thousands of requests for domestic violence services go unmet. Thousands of calls to the National Domestic Violence Hotline go unanswered. And in times of economic downturn, the rates of domestic violence tend to increase. That's why this reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act was so very important. Not only were we able to increase outreach to victims on college campuses and expand protections for victims living on tribal lands, but for the first time we extended access to protections for immigrant and LGBT victims. And so as a member of the Appropriations Committee, I'm going to continue to fight for robust funding at all levels so that we can continue to provide victims with the services they need. With strong investments, we can address this crisis and end domestic violence once and for all. Although we've made great progress, we cannot claim victory. October is a critical time to raise awareness to what continues to be a pervasive issue in our country. But we must remember that for women, children, and men who are experiencing or who have experienced domestic violence, every day must be a day of awareness. So we must support all of the legislation and funding efforts that will indicate that finally, mind you, finally, we will not need Domestic Violence Awareness Month ever again because we have put an end to domestic violence. Thank you again, Mr. Green.
I thank you, and I also thank you for raising the issue of domestic violence against men. We talk quite often about it being against women, and there's good reason. The overwhelming empirical evidence connotes that women are the large victims of domestic violence. So I thank you for broadening the issue for us. Thank you very much. At this time, Mr. Speaker, I'm honored to tell you that we have a congressman from the state of Florida. I was reared in Florida, went to Florida A&M University. He serves the 18th District of Florida, serves on financial services, and he is committed to working across the aisle. He makes a concerted effort to achieve bipartisanship. He is a champion for fair play, but I also want you to know that he understands that as we do this, as we try to end this scourge on society known as domestic violence, that it is more than simply an issue of violence. It also has economic components to it. And he has tried to cause us to understand some of these components, but also that it is a moral issue. I would now ask that my friend who accorded me this tie that is purple, the color purple in the tie, as I understand it, represents courage, survival, honor, and dedication. Dedication to ending domestic violence, and of course, purple is being worn today to spread awareness of domestic violence. I now ask my friend, the Honorable Patrick Murphy, to consume such time as he may.
Well, thank you, Mr. Green, for organizing this special hour, and I also want to thank Mr. Poe, Ms. Edwards, and Ms. Elmers for their leadership on this important issue. I rise today to speak out against domestic violence and to demand that Congress act in a bipartisan manner to fight back against this plague on our country. The domestic violence statistic rates in our country are staggering. 1 out of every 3 women will be the victim of domestic violence in their lifetime, and 4 are murdered by their intimate partner every day in the United States. Further, a woman is battered in the United States every 15 seconds. You do the math, that's 240 incidents every hour. We as a society have a responsibility to work to protect the most vulnerable among us and must do everything we can to address these unacceptable rates of domestic violence. That is why one of the first pieces of legislation I co-sponsored as a member of Congress was the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act. Protecting people from violence by their partners should not be a partisan issue. And it was appalling in the last Congress that such vital legislation got caught up in this partisan gridlock. With that in mind, I am thrilled to see members from both sides of the aisle speaking today on this important issue. And you will notice both Democrats and Republicans wearing purple pins or purple ties to highlight October as Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Domestic violence is not a partisan issue and not just a woman's issue. It's a family issue, it's a community issue, it's an economic issue, and a moral issue. That is why I specifically recruited male colleagues to participate in this special order hour, and you will see many of them here today wearing purple ties. We as men can help draw awareness not only to how important it is to work toward ending domestic violence, but also to the fact that domestic violence is an issue that we have a responsibility to engage and not to dismiss as only a women's issue. As role models and other males, we have a crucial part in this fight, and stopping domestic violence will only occur when the main perpetrators of these crimes, which are men, learn to stop hurting their partners. We as men not only can, but we must make addressing this issue a priority. On International Women's Day, I hosted a roundtable discussion at a shelter in my district called Safe Space, where I heard from both survivors and advocates about the challenges they face to keep women and children safe, and the importance of federal funding to keep these programs operating. This roundtable highlighted the urgency of working together to address this pressing issue. And I am honored to have Jill Borowitz here, the CEO of the shelter that hosted this important roundtable, be in attendance with us today. And I want to take this opportunity to thank her for her work on behalf of all the survivors of domestic abuse. Unfortunately, what we are doing here today almost was not able to take place due to the government shutdown. Jill knows all too well what the shutdown did back home and the effects of it were on our district and across the country. One of the less talked about effects of the shutdown was its impact on shelters and services like Safe Space that were forced to close their doors and suspend services for more than a week because VAWA funds were inaccessible. Let me repeat. The government shutdown directly prevented women and children who were facing the threat of domestic violence from receiving services and shelter. This is unconscionable. While the crisis may have been manufactured, the shutdown was very real, and the consequences were also real. And it has shown that partisanship and dysfunction in Congress are a serious threat to the prevention of domestic violence. And I hope we can all agree that this should no longer be tolerated. I look forward to working together with my colleagues, both male and female, and members from both parties to continue to fund important programs that help provide assistance and shelter to the victims of domestic violence, resources to law enforcement to help them adequately address these issues on the ground, and investments in programs that can help stop and break the vicious cycle of domestic violence in our communities. Again, I want to thank Mr. Green for his leadership on this issue. It's important we bring this to the forefront. No matter where you're from or what party you're from, this is something that needs to be discussed. So I yield the balance of my time. Thank you.
I thank my fellow Floridian, and I, of course, am from Texas now, but my roots are in Florida, and I thank you so much. Mr. Speaker, how much time do we have left?
You have approximately 12 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm honored at this time to recognize another Texan, a Texan from the 23rd District who served 22 years, Mr. Speaker, in the State House, a Texan who serves on the Agriculture Committee, a Texan who is a strong supporter of domestic awareness, who voted for the reauthorization of the VAWA, and I might say a Texan who started his career in Congress extending his hand across the aisle. He is one who not only preaches bipartisanship, he practices it. I'm honored to ask that my friend, the Honorable Pete Gallego, consume as much time as he may.
Thank you so much. I appreciate very much, Congressman Green, your leadership on this issue. It is incredibly important. As I listened to Congressman Murphy and others talk on this issue, and you realize that 1 out of every 3 women will feel the impact of domestic violence in her lifetime, you have to realize that even among the people in this room, we know people who have been impacted by domestic violence. All of us have a mom. Many of us have sisters. Domestic violence can impact anyone. Even though it's not openly spoken about many times, even though it's not openly addressed in our society, and even though many feel that it's something that could never happen to them, the truth is, it could happen to anybody. And it could happen to people other than women. 14% of the victims of domestic violence are men. In 2012, in Texas alone, 114 people were killed. In the district that I represent, from El Paso to San Antonio, there were 8 cases of domestic violence. Now, everyone here, many of you have met my son, who has become the center of my universe. And I will tell you that children are incredibly important. They're certainly important to me and to the members of this chamber, the members of this body. And the truth is that kids are also impacted by violence, because many times the child is also assaulted. In fact, according to a task force report, in several instances, the young children at the scene of the crime was also attacked. And in fact, they were stabbed or strangled or shot or kidnapped, or some violence was committed on the children. These numbers are heartbreaking. There are far too many people impacted, and the sad part is that most of the time, there are many signs of trouble. You can see it. There's a time in the life of every problem where it's big enough to see, but still small enough to solve. Researchers and service providers have already identified some common characteristics that help predict the risk factor as a precursor to intimate partner murders. Stalking, for example. Stalking ranks as a top indicator of risk. Nationally, 76% of those cases involve at least one episode of stalking within a year prior to the murder. 1 in 6 women report having experienced stalking, which made them feel very fearful or believe that they or someone close to them would be harmed or killed. Intimate partner violence manifests itself from dehumanizing attitudes and beliefs, and it results in cruelty, brutality, degradation of the victim's physical, mental, and spiritual well-being. 99% of all women who have died as a result of domestic violence never stayed in a shelter, and 95 had no contact with a certified domestic violence center within 5 years of their death. There is help out there. We just need to get people to the help. And the only way that we can do that is if more people are aware of the resources that are available to victims of domestic violence. As I said, all of us, statistically, we're going to know someone who has been impacted by domestic violence. And it's very important that we all work together to make sure that they all have the help that they need. On any given day in the U.S., over 60,000 women and kids, 60,000, think about that, 60,000 women and kids are residing in domestic violence shelters. The shelters provide a critical service. And it's up to us, our states, our communities, and our fellow citizens to make a difference, to make sure that we step up to the plate and keep these resources available, keep the help where we need to help, so that we can stop those hearts from breaking, we can mend those lives, and we can help those kids. I had the great privilege, as Mr. Green alluded, to serving in the Texas legislature for a long time, including service as chairman of the Committee of Jurisdiction, the Committee on Criminal Jurisprudence, and I carried a lot of legislation for victims of domestic violence. I'm very proud of those activities. I'm very proud of that opportunity to be of service, and I hope that all 435 members of this body and 100 members on the other side of this building will all together in a very bipartisan fashion, stand up and say, let's put an end to domestic violence. Thank you so much for your time.
I thank my colleague from the state of Texas, and I would also mention to my colleague, unfortunately, one study concluded that 10,401 domestic violence victims reached out for help but were turned away because of a lack of resources. There is still great work to be done, and I thank you for continuing to do this great work. God bless you. At this time, Mr. Speaker, we have another Texan from the 18th Congressional District in Houston, Texas, who serves on Homeland Security as well as Judiciary. We're going to ask that our friend, the Honorable Sheila Jackson Lee, move to the podium. And how much time do we have left, Mr. Speaker?
The gentleman from Texas has 6 minutes left.
Okay, I ask that members govern themselves accordingly with 6 minutes left.
Let me thank the gentleman from Texas for his service and for his commitment to an issue that is so vital and important to the nation, and that is protection of all Americans from domestic violence. And there is a long history to the journey of this Congress to responding to the cry of women and men, both in the civilian life and in the United States military. I rise today to respond and respect that we are acknowledging, commemorating Domestic Violence Prevention Month. I remember the journey that we took in getting the Violence Against Women's Act, the prevention of that, with our former and late chair of the Judiciary Committee, Chairman Hyde. And remember in the early stages of the 1990s, the then attempt to reauthorize this legislation. The good news was that Chairman Hyde, a Republican, and Ranking Member Conyers at that time, and senators on both sides of the aisle joined together in one big room to come together and acknowledge the importance of protecting women, and then, of course, to acknowledge that violence, domestic violence, is a disease, an epidemic that spreads beyond the question of whether you are male or female. And so the staggering loss of life that has come about because people have not found a refuge. And for those of us who have heard firsthand stories, as a member of the Houston Area Women's Center, the board that in Houston, the board that, if you will, had supervision over local women's centers where women could go, I have known and seen stories that would argue so vigorously for more funding and more recognition and more laws that would protect these women. So I am glad that even though the journey was even longer to get the Violence Against Women's Act passed in the last Congress, that we ultimately, after many petitions that we were involved in, saw a bipartisan vote in the House and the Senate, much longer in the House, that allowed us to go to the President's desk. So my remarks, as I summarize, are to say that this is an ongoing cause. Domestic violence comes from tension and pressure, but it results in the violence that results in the loss of life. Time after time, women and children suffer a loss of life through violence by a spouse or a loved one. And of course, we know that it occurs with men. Time after time, women in the United States military suffer the act of violence, domestic violence, or violence against women. So I want to thank the gentleman for giving me the opportunity to at least acknowledge that this is a somber occasion and there is great need for continued support. My last sentence, Mr. Green, you mentioned resources. I hope as we leave this floor that we'll all reinforce the elimination of the sequester and a budget process that will allow the funding of vital programs like the Violence Against Women Act. I thank the gentleman for yielding.
And because time is of the essence, I will move quickly to the gentleman from the 41st District of California, the Honorable Mark Takano.
I thank the gentleman from Texas for yielding time. I stand today to join my colleagues in recognizing Domestic Violence Awareness Month. The unfortunate reality is that domestic violence is something that affects every community in America as it touches every race, class, gender, and sexual orientation. Millions of domestic violence incidents are reported each year, and many more go unreported. Too often, domestic violence remains within the confines of the household, as many victims do not contact law enforcement or go public, often out of fear. When it was first observed 26 years ago, Domestic Violence Awareness Month sought to shine a light on this tragic reality by educating the public, empowering the victims, and punishing the offenders. And in the 26 years since, we have made great progress, partly due to the Violence Against Women Act, which provides critical support to programs for victims and their families, as well as resources for law enforcement and community organizations. With a 51% increase in reporting by women and a 37% increase in reporting by men, the results have been nothing short of incredible. Domestic violence is wrong, and no victim should be hesitant to report it. I encourage every American who feels threatened or who knows someone in a dangerous situation to contact law enforcement or a community organization. Together, we can strive to end domestic violence and end abuse in our communities. Thank you. I yield back to the gentleman.
Thank you. And Mr. Speaker, I do thank you for your indulgence. You have been liberal with the time. And I want to remind persons that while we do this on an annual basis in the month of October, we